Before I begin, I want to thank Pastor McReynolds and the Anon Missionary Baptist Church for graciously allowing me to use this beautiful church that I have visited before. When I was here in September, I made a commitment to the Prude family and the Rochester community that I would do everything in my power to ensure justice was served in the death of Daniel Prude. I made a commitment that we would engage in a thorough and exhaustive review of all of the facts and events that led to Mr. Prude's death. And I made a commitment to be as transparent as possible. In the course of our investigation, we concluded that there was sufficient evidence surrounding Mr. Prude's death to warrant presenting the case to a grand jury. We presented the strongest case possible, but today, the grand jury decided not to indict any police officer on charges related to Daniel Prude's death. I know that the Prude family, the Rochester community, and communities across the country will rightfully be disappointed by this outcome. My office presented an extensive case, and we sought a different outcome than the one the grand jury handed us today. We made every attempt to demonstrate the facts, but ultimately we have to respect the decision. I want to thank the members of the grand jury for their service. The criminal justice system has frustrated efforts to hold law enforcement officers accountable for the unjustified killing of unarmed African Americans. And what binds these cases is a tragic loss of life in circumstances in which the death could have been avoided. These incidents have challenged public confidence and trust in our criminal justice system. And history has unfortunately repeated itself again in the case of Daniel Prude. The criminal justice system is badly in need of reform. The system was built to protect and shield officers from wrongdoing and accountability. The system too often allows officers to use deadly force unnecessarily and without consequence. And that is a system that at its core is broken. Someone once said that the dead cannot cry out for justice. It is a duty of the living to do so for them. So in the coming weeks and months, I will be pursuing a multifaceted approach to addressing the very issues that have prevented us from holding officers accountable who use deadly force without justification. The cornerstone of this effort is to amend the use of force law from one of subjective, simple necessity to one of absolute last resort, exhausting all other non-lethal means before resorting to deadly force. And while there is a legitimate reason why police officers have some special protections, these protections should be clearly delineated and clearly standardized in state law. Our goal is to preserve lives by ensuring that officers have the tools they need to navigate challenging civilian interactions, and that prosecutors have the laws they need to hold police accountable and deliver justice when officers use force in an unjustified or excessive manner. And so, one, we will seek to amend our law justifying use of force by police officers to ensure that officers only use lethal force as a last resort, again, exhausting all other non-lethal means. Two, These standards should be based on an objective criteria, and failure to adhere to them should result in and will result in criminal penalties. 3, we will mandate statewide certification for all officers, as they just recently did in New Jersey, and require robust and regular training as part of that certification to ensure officers have the training necessary to navigate challenging civilian interactions, and to avoid officers who are dismissed for wrongdoing from just moving to another county or another state. And when officers are fined for misconduct or found to have violated certain laws or standards, the state can revoke their certification to ensure these officers do not bounce again from one department to another. As I have contended throughout my entire career, there can be no accountability without transparency. And so I once again call for grand jury reform. Grand jury secrecy rules should be relaxed. The public deserves to know what transpired behind closed doors. The current secrecy laws are just out of date, anachronistic. In an effort to provide maximum transparency, my office is proactively releasing a comprehensive report which should be released to all of you, the media, in minutes, if you have not received it already. A comprehensive report about Mr. Prude's death, including a minute-by-minute account of the events on March 22nd and March 23rd, 2020, and all of the other evidence and facts that we collected over the course of our investigation outside of the grand jury process. And what that report depicts is a man in the throes of a mental health crisis who was literally crying out for help the only way that he knew. And his brother, Joe, he also placed a call for help. He didn't call for the police to come deal with a law enforcement crisis. He called for emergency medical professionals to deal with a mental health crisis. The officers who responded on March 22nd knew that Mr. Prude was experiencing this mental health crisis, and medical experts have recognized it as excited delirium, a state that can cause individuals to act irrationally. It can also put individuals at great risk of death if subjected to increased stress. Yet the officers who ultimately restrained Mr. Prude were largely unfamiliar with how to handle this type of medical emergency. And this is not a new or isolated problem. Throughout my 2 years as the Attorney General and as the Special Prosecutor, it is so unfortunate that we have repeated and observed similar cases all throughout the state with strikingly similar factual characteristics. Excited delirium is accepted by medical professionals and requires an immediate and coordinated response. All police officers, emergency dispatch providers, and EMTs must be trained to recognize the symptoms and trained to respond to it as the serious medical emergency it is. It is also my contention that the state should analyze spit hoods and whether or not they are appropriate in cases where individuals are experiencing mental health concerns. And while there was no evidence that the spit hood placed over Mr. Prude's head directly contributed to his death, it clearly added to his stress and agitation. We know that Daniel Prude was experiencing a mental health crisis, and the service that he received was devoid of compassion and trained professionals. My heart aches for the Prude family and for the countless others who have suffered just as they have. And so right after this press conference, I will meet with Mr. Prude's brother, And during my time here in Rochester, I will also meet with local elected officials, criminal justice reform advocates, and faith leaders to discuss ways we can continue to fight for a more just system. The voices of individuals of goodwill must be heard, and they are marching and crying out for a criminal justice system that is fair and just. And so we must use boulders of righteousness and hammers of intentional activism and mallets of moral clarity to bend the arc, the moral arc towards justice, and bring real equality in our time for all of God's people. And I'm committed to effecting the change that is so desperately needed. And I promise you that I will be unshakable in my efforts to see it through. And with that, I'll take some questions.
Thank you. Wendy Wright from Spectrum News.
Hi.
Thank you for taking our question. Wanted to ask you if you have any more information in regards to why the grand jury chose not to indict. Were you able to learn anything more about the specifics?
So the information is subject to grand jury secrecy laws, and so it is under seal at this time. And although I wish and, as you know, have advocated for transparency, that decision is ultimately up to the judge.
Attorney General Dan Higgins from the New York Times. Could you please address whether you are personally outraged by this outcome with the grand jury and whether you fear that this outcome might embolden officers or those who believe that no crime occurred?
I am disappointed, extremely disappointed. Unfortunately, historically, if one analyzes the intersection of the criminal justice system and race, one recognizes the influence of race. From the slave codes, to the lynching, to Jim Crow, to the war on crime, to the over-incarceration of people of color. Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and now Daniel Prude. We need to have a conversation about this issue. And the reality is that we all of us suffer from unconscious bias. But we need to have there needs to be systematic change in the criminal justice system and policing in New York and all throughout this nation. And we need to analyze the numbers, analyze the race of the individuals who are no longer with us, and reform the practices if we are going to focus on a more just criminal justice system and a more perfect union.
Attorney General Jen Lukey from News 10 NBC. What crimes do you believe these police officers committed? What did you ask the grand jury to consider?
Unfortunately, given that question, it is subject to grand jury secrecy, and it is currently under seal. And as I mentioned earlier, all throughout my career, I've advocated for transparency, and ultimately that decision resides with the judge.
But as a prosecutor yourself, just personally, what do you believe the crime was here?
I think, again, my personal opinion is irrelevant. The fact is as a prosecutor and as a special prosecutor, one has to analyze the facts and apply the law. And I wish that I could be more transparent at this point in time, but the decision ultimately resides with the judge. Thank you.
Thank you. Will Cleveland, Democrat and Chronicle. With everything that's gone on in Rochester, like what are you seeing in Rochester that you think needs to change? I mean, we see Mr. Prude, we've seen Christopher Pate before this, we've seen the 9-year-old who was just pepper sprayed. I mean, what sort of systematic changes do you think you need to see within the Rochester Police Department that aren't being addressed right now?
So we can start with the package that I've laid out before you. Use of force standards, coordinated mental health approach to individuals who are struggling with excited delirium, analyze the use of spit hoods, and make sure that individuals and officers are trained in de-escalation and unconscious bias. In addition to that, I will be meeting with the 9-year-old girl who is unfortunately pepper sprayed. And our office is looking at that case, and we will be meeting with her and her family. We need to take a systematic look at policing in Rochester, and not just Rochester, but all throughout the state of New York. As you know, the governor of the state of New York has urged each and every department to put forth some policing reforms. I'm looking forward to analyzing each and every one of those applications to the governor of the state of New York.
Ms. James, Adam Chodak with News 8. You've had a
Where are
chance
you?
to
Okay. Hi.
You've had a chance to look into not only the details of the encounter itself, but the case as we saw it roll out over the months following. What's your take on how the city and RPD handled this case after they learned about it?
So let me just say that there have been a number of reports that have been issued in response to the incident. My focus is on policing and preventing the death of unarmed individuals, particularly in cases where it could have been prevented. And so it's important that we move forward and have an honest discussion about the platform that I've put forth, systematic changes that are necessary, and ensuring that we respect the dignity of all lives, not only in Rochester, but all throughout the state of New York. What was your question? Oh, again, I'm responding again to police reforms.
Attorney General Tyler Brown with 13 Lamp News. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but obviously the 7 officers that have been suspended since the investigation began. What is the status on that? Will they be allowed to work back in law enforcement again? And in your opinion, should they be able to work in law enforcement again?
Those recommendations and that decision will ultimately be left up to the Rochester Police Department. At this point, the criminal aspect of this investigation has been completed. I would imagine that there will be a civil action taken by the family. I'm hoping, again, I'm hoping that the legislature will pass systematic reforms that focus on policing and that prevent the death of any other unarmed individual, particularly in cases where it could have been avoided, and particularly when individuals are unfortunately suffering from excited delirium.